The ranch stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun, a sea of golden grass swaying with the wind. Day after day, the lonely rancher worked in silence, his only companions the creak of the saddle and the call of distant crows. His hands were rough from years of labor, his face weathered by sun and storm. At dusk, when the sky turned red and the cattle settled, he would walk back to a house that stood quiet, its rooms echoing with emptiness. No laughter, no warmth, just the sound of boots on wooden floors. Though his land was vast and his herds were plenty, his heart carried a hollow space, one that no harvest and no sunrise had ever managed to fill. When the sun slipped behind the horizon, the ranch house stood in quiet shadow. Inside, the walls seemed to breathe with silence. The wooden table sat with one plate, one cup, never touched by company. The fire in the hearth burned low, its crackle the only voice in the room. Nights were long, filled with the sound of wind pressing against the windows and coyotes crying far off in the dark. The rancher would lie awake on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams, feeling the weight of an empty house pressing on him. A man could survive the harsh land and the storms of the prairie, but it was the silence, deep, unbroken silence that cut into him the most. Though his days were full of work, and his nights heavy with silence, there was always a shadow in his heart he could not shake. It was the feeling of something missing, something unseen yet deeply felt. At times, he would pause in the middle of the fields, leaning against a fence post, watching the horizon as if waiting for someone to appear. When he sat on the porch at sundown, the rocking chair beside him stayed empty, and its stillness seemed louder than the crickets in the grass. He could not name what he longed for. Perhaps laughter, perhaps a gentle voice. But he knew his life, vast as the land he owned, was incomplete without it. One dusty afternoon, as the rancher leaned against his gate and watched the road cut through the prairie, a wagon rattled past. Its wheels groaned against the dirt, pulling a load that seemed more burden than cargo. On the back sat a woman, her shoulders slumped, her dress torn and faded from too many years of wear. The men driving the wagon spoke to her like she was nothing, tossing sharp words as if she were less than human. She kept her eyes low, clutching a small bundle close to her chest, as though it was the only thing keeping her from shattering completely. To the townsfolk, she was just another forgotten soul, but to the rancher's eyes, there was something haunting in her silence, like a story no one cared to hear. As the wagon disappeared into the haze of dust, the rancher's gaze lingered on the woman's bowed head. A question stirred quietly in his mind, one he could not let go of. Why is she unwanted? In a world where every man longed for a wife, every home longed for a woman's touch, how could she be treated as if she had no worth? What pain had carved that sadness into her face? What story lay buried behind those downcast eyes? The prairie was filled with harsh winds and lonely roads, but none as cruel as the thought of a soul cast aside, left to be spoken of like a burden. The question settled in his heart, heavy and unshakable, driving him to look deeper into the life of the woman no one else wanted. Her story unfolded like a shadow in the rancher's mind, as if the wind itself carried whispers of her past. She had once been a young bride, standing shyly beneath the wooden beams of a small church, her eyes filled with timid hope. The vows she spoke were soft, trembling with the belief that love would protect her. But that hope soon withered. The man she married was not gentle. His words were sharp, his hands heavy. What began as promises turned into chains. Her days were filled with fear, her nights with silent tears. Each season carved more sorrow into her spirit, until the girl she once was disappeared, leaving behind only a woman carrying the weight of broken dreams. She had been barely more than a girl when her family gave her away, her hands trembling as they placed them into the grip of a man twice her age. To the outside world, it seemed like security. a husband with land, cattle, and a name. But behind closed doors, his heart was cold, his temper quick, and his love absent. He saw her not as a partner, but as property, something to control rather than cherish. She learned quickly that her laughter was unwelcome, her questions dangerous, and her dreams worthless. The home that should have been her shelter became her prison, and every day she lived under his roof felt like another chain tightening around her spirit. The man's cruelty grew sharper with every passing year, for he carried one desire that burned like fire in his pride. He wanted sons, strong boys to carry his name, to work his land, to prove his worth among other men. But fate gave him daughters, soft little hands and gentle eyes that he could never see as blessings. With each child she bore, his disappointment deepened into rage. He looked at the girls not as gifts, but as failures, and turned that blame on their mother. To him, she had failed him again and again, though she had given all of herself. She would cradle her daughters close, whispering love into their ears, even as his voice thundered through the house, making them flinch. For her, those children were her only light, yet for him they were the reason he cast her deeper into darkness. The years that followed broke her down piece by piece. Each time the man's anger rose, she became his target. His fists, his words, his cold silences leaving scars no one could see. The neighbors heard but turned away, pretending it wasn't their place. She was rejected not only by the man she called husband, but by a world that looked the other way. And when his bitterness could no longer be contained, he cast her out altogether, as if she were nothing more than a burden he had carried too long. With only her daughters clinging to her torn dress, she was left standing in the dust, abandoned with no roof, no home, and no hand to hold. The cruelest wound was not the beating, not the rejection. It was the hollow truth that she had been thrown away, as though her life held no worth. When the door closed behind her for the last time, she carried nothing but her daughters in her arms and the weight of her past on her back. Every step she took across the dusty road was heavy with shame, as if the whole world could see the bruises that never faded, the wounds that never healed. The scars on her skin told one story, but the deeper ones lived in her heart. Memories of nights she cried silently, of days she begged for kindness that never came. She walked with her head lowered, not because she was weak, but because life had beaten her into believing she was unworthy of lifting it. Though broken, she still moved forward, carrying both her pain and the faintest spark of strength, the kind a woman finds only when she has nothing left but survival. One evening, while the rancher rode into town for supplies, his eyes fell upon a sight that unsettled him. In the corner of a dim, smoke-filled tavern, she stood with a tray in her hands, her dress worn thin, her eyes hollow. Men called for her harshly, tossing coins on the table as if she were no better than the ale she served. Some laughed at her, some sneered, and others treated her as though she were invisible. To them, she was a woman stripped of dignity, a life sold cheap like cattle at the market. Yet the rancher saw something else, something in the way she kept her head down but clutched her hands tightly, as if holding on to the last threads of her pride. In that moment, he felt an ache in his chest, the kind a man feels when he sees a soul forgotten by the world. Laughter rang through the tavern, but it wasn't the kind that warmed a room. It was sharp, cruel, and meant to wound. A group of men leaned back in their chairs, pointing at her with mocking grins. "She's no good," one sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Another chuckled, adding, "Not even worth a warm meal." Their words cut deeper than any blade, each insult reminding her of the chains she thought she had left behind. She lowered her gaze, pretending not to hear, but her trembling hands betrayed her pain as she set mugs down on the table. To them, she was nothing but a shadow, a woman with no value. But the rancher, watching from across the room, saw the cruelty for what it was, and felt a quiet anger stir within him. The rancher rose from his seat without a word, his boots striking the tavern floor with a steady rhythm. He didn't shout or demand attention, he simply walked forward, his broad shadow stretching across the lamplight. The room fell into a hush as he stopped near her, his weathered face calm but his eyes sharp with quiet fire. Without looking at the men who mocked her, he reached into his coat, placed a few coins on the counter, and said in a low, steady voice, "She's done enough for the night." His tone was firm, not cruel, but it carried a weight that silenced the laughter. In that small act, without raising his hand or voice, he drew a line no one dared to cross. And for the first time in years, she felt someone had stood between her and the world's cruelty. He did not offer her false kindness, nor did he speak words soaked in pity. Instead, he treated her as though she mattered, something no one had done in a long time. He handed her the coins not like payment to a servant, but like respect to an equal. "For your work," he said simply, his eyes steady, giving her the choice to take it with her head held high. There was no softness meant to make her feel weak, no sympathy meant to remind her of her pain. What he gave her was far greater, a sense of dignity. In that moment, she was not the useless woman the world mocked. She was a person seen, valued, and honored, and that quiet gesture struck deeper than any grand promise ever could. For a moment, she just stared at him, the coins resting in her hand like something unreal. Shock flickered across her face. No man had ever looked at her without scorn or desire, yet behind the surprise there was caution in her eyes. Life had taught her bitter lessons. Kindness often came with a hidden price, and gentle words were sometimes the mask of cruel intentions. She tightened her grip on the coins, her shoulders stiff, as if bracing for the trap she believed would follow. Gratitude lingered on her lips, but fear held it back. She wanted to trust, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. And so she studied him in silence, wondering what kind of man would stand for her, when the rest of the world had already turned away. A few days later, with nowhere else to turn, and the weight of her past pressing hard upon her, she followed the rancher out to his land. The journey was quiet, the creak of the wagon wheels and the call of prairie birds filling the spaces where words would not come. When they arrived, the wide stretch of his ranch opened before her, rolling fields, sturdy fences, and a weathered house that seemed as lonely as the man himself. He carried her bundle inside without a word, setting it gently by the doorway, as if making room for her was the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in years, she stepped into a place not as a servant, not as a burden, but as someone who belonged. Yet in her heart, she could not shake the fear that this peace might vanish just as quickly as it had come. In the days that followed, she moved through the ranch with quiet steps, keeping her distance as though any wrong move might cost her the fragile shelter she had found. She rose early, working beside him in the fields, mending fences, tending to the cattle, or carrying buckets of water. They spoke little, only what was necessary. Her eyes often stayed lowered, her words measured, as if revealing too much of herself might invite disappointment or anger. He never pressed, never demanded, simply matched her silence with his own steady patience. To him, her guarded ways were not weakness, but proof of the battles she had survived. To her, the silence was safety, a wall she built to protect what little remained of her heart. Yet somewhere in that quiet labor, trust began to take root, as steady and unnoticed as seeds sprouting beneath the soil. Though he longed to bridge the distance, the rancher never reached for more than she was ready to give. He kept his voice calm, his touch absent, his presence steady but never pressing. At supper, he would sit across the table, letting the silence rest comfortably between them rather than filling it with questions. When she chose to sleep in the small room at the end of the hall, he left it untouched, never crossing the boundary she had drawn. Even in the fields, when their hands brushed by accident while passing a tool, He would step back, offering her space instead of pulling her closer. It wasn't indifference. It was respect. He understood that closeness forced was no closeness at all, and so he waited, letting her see that his patience was not a mask but the truth of who he was. Every gesture from the rancher carried quiet respect. He knocked before entering a room, even in his own house. He never questioned where she went when she wandered the fields, nor did he demand explanations for the shadows that sometimes crossed her face. At meals, he made sure her plate was full before touching his own, not out of duty, but out of simple regard. When townsfolk cast curious glances, he never spoke for her, allowing her voice to rise when she chose. In a world that had once smothered her, he gave her something rare, space to breathe, space to heal, space to simply exist without fear. That respect was more than kindness. It was a quiet promise that here she would never again be treated as less than she was. At first, the ranch felt foreign, just another place she might be cast out from. But as the weeks turned into months, its silence began to change. The creak of the windmill, the lowing of cattle, the gentle rustle of wheat in the fields, all became sounds of comfort rather than loneliness. She started leaving her room door open at night, letting the faint glow of the hearth remind her she was not alone. In the mornings, she would pause on the porch, breathing in the wide prairie air, feeling for the first time that the horizon was not a cage, but freedom. The land that once seemed endless and cold now held her like a quiet embrace. Slowly, the ranch was no longer just his. It was hers, too, a place where fear loosened its grip and healing could finally take root. Even as the ranch wrapped her in safety, a storm still lived inside her. She could not look in the mirror without hearing the old words, useless, worthless, unwanted. They echoed like ghosts, convincing her that love was something meant for others, never for her. When the rancher offered her kindness, she mistook it for pity. When his eyes lingered on her with quiet warmth, she turned away, unable to believe it was real. She carried her scars like proof that she did not deserve affection, as if her past had forever marked her as unworthy. To imagine someone truly loving her felt like a dream too fragile to touch. So she built walls around her heart, convincing herself it was better to stay behind them than risk watching them crumble again. In town, the whispers never stopped. Whenever she walked beside the rancher, carrying supplies or passing through the market, eyes followed her, sharp and unkind. Women pulled their children closer, murmuring behind gloved hands. Men smirked, nudging each other with cruel laughter. "That's the one no man wanted," they said under their breath. Some called her cursed. Others claimed she had ruined her first husband's life. Each word stung like a thorn, reminding her of wounds that had barely begun to heal. She pretended not to hear, keeping her head down, but the voices found their way into her heart, dragging back the shame she fought so hard to bury. And though the rancher's steady presence was a shield, she wondered how long it would be before even he grew tired of defending her. Trust, for her, was like a fragile glass. Once shattered, impossible to piece together without bleeding. Every time the rancher showed her patience, she wanted to believe it, to lean into the quiet strength of his presence. But then the memories returned, the broken promises, the harsh hands, the laughter of men who swore love yet dealt only pain. She kept her heart locked tight, afraid that opening it even a little would invite betrayal once more. At night, when the house grew still, she sometimes caught herself wondering if he, too, would one day grow cruel, if his kindness was only waiting for the right moment to fade. She longed to trust him, but fear wrapped itself around her like chains, pulling her back whenever she dared step closer. The rancher bore her distance with the same quiet strength he brought to every hardship of the land. He never hurried her, never demanded what she could not give. Each day, he worked beside her, content with the simple rhythm of shared labor, yet inside his heart ached with longing. He watched her laugh softly with the calves in the pasture, her face lighting in moments she thought no one saw, and wished he could be the reason for that smile. At night, he would sit by the fire, his eyes drifting to the empty chair across from him, imagining her there. Not as a shadowed guest, but as his partner. His patience was not born of weakness, but of deep love, a love strong enough to wait as long as it took for her to believe she was worthy of it. It began in the smallest of ways. A cup of coffee left warm on the table for him before he rose at dawn. A shawl draped quietly over her shoulders when the evening wind grew cold. He would steady the ladder as she reached for tools, his hands firm but gentle, and she would whisper a soft, "Thank you," her eyes meeting his for just a breath longer than before. When she stumbled carrying a heavy bucket, he was there to catch it, not with scolding words, but with a quiet smile that eased her shame. Each gesture was simple, almost ordinary, but together they wove something fragile yet powerful: trust. In those fleeting moments, the distance between them began to shrink, not with sudden declarations, but with the tender weight of kindness slowly shared. Just as the wounds of her past began to close, the shadows found their way back. One evening in town, she froze at the sound of a voice she knew too well, her old husband's bitter drawl, cutting through the air like a whip. His eyes found her, full of the same scorn she had once endured, and his words spilled loud enough for all to hear. Still useless. Still a burden. Laughter stirred among the crowd, and the whispers returned, sharper than before. Some townsfolk smirked, feeding the cruelty with their silence, while others mocked her openly, as if her pain was nothing more than entertainment. The old fear surged inside her, dragging her back to the years when she had no defense. Her hands trembled, her breath caught, and for a moment it felt as if all the strength she had found on the ranch would shatter beneath the weight of his voice. Before the cruelty could crush her completely, the rancher stepped forward. His boots struck the ground with a weight that silenced the snickers around them. He placed himself between her and the man who had once broken her, his shoulders broad, his stance unshaken. His voice was calm, but it carried the strength of thunder. "You'll speak no more of her." The old husband sneered, but the rancher's steady gaze held a warning sharper than any blade. When the townsfolk whispered, he turned his eyes on them too, daring anyone to laugh again. In that moment, he was not only a man protecting a woman, he was a wall, unmovable and unyielding, shielding her from every cruel word that dared to touch her. And for the first time, she stood behind someone who refused to let the world treat her as less than she was. The old husband, stung by the rancher's defiance, spat into the dust and stepped closer, his fists curling with the same rage she remembered all too well. The tavern crowd leaned in, eager for spectacle, their whispers turning into a restless hum. With one shove, the man tried to push past, his venom spilling in curses, but the rancher did not yield. A hard silence fell before the first blow landed, fists striking, boots scraping against the wooden floor. Chairs toppled, mugs shattered, and the crowd erupted around them. Each punch the rancher threw carried not just strength, but years of fury on her behalf, years she had been too broken to fight for herself. And though the old husband staggered back, still spitting cruelty, the truth was clear to every watching eye. This was no longer a woman left defenseless. She had someone who would stand, bleed, and fight, so she would never again be alone. When the dust of the fight settled, the whispers in town carried a new tone. No longer did they mock her as the unwanted woman. They had seen the rancher risk everything for her, and it forced them to look again. Some remembered the way she worked tirelessly at the market, how she stretched a single coin to feed her children. Others noticed how she carried herself now, not with arrogance, but with quiet resilience. The bruises of her past had not destroyed her, they had made her endure. Slowly, heads that once turned away began to nod in silent respect. Women who had once pitied her now watched with a trace of admiration, and men who had sneered held their tongues. She was no longer just the woman cast aside. She was the woman the rancher chose, the one he stood for, and in that choice, the town began to see her worth. It came to her slowly, not in a single moment, but in the quiet days that followed. She watched the rancher move through his world, steady and unchanging, never once treating her like a burden to carry or a soul to rescue. He did not wrap her in pity, nor did he try to erase her scars. Instead, he walked beside her, whether in the fields under the blazing sun or at the table in the dim glow of lamplight, always close enough to be felt, but never so close as to confine her. And in that patient nearness, she understood. He had never wanted to save her. He only wanted to share the road, to match his steps with hers, to let her heal in her own time. That truth broke something open inside her, not with pain, but with a fragile, unfamiliar warmth she had long believed she would never feel again. To the rancher, her beauty was not in smooth skin or polished grace, but in the quiet strength she carried. He saw it in the way she rose each morning despite the weight of her past, in the way she held her daughters close as if her love alone could shield them from the world. He noticed it when her hands, though rough from labor, still found gentleness in mending torn clothes or soothing a frightened calf. The lines of sorrow on her face did not make her less. They told the story of a woman who had endured and still stood tall. Where others saw flaws, he saw proof of survival. To him, she was not broken. She was remarkable, her strength a beauty that no storm or cruel word could ever take away. At first, her smiles were fleeting, small, uncertain things that flickered and faded before anyone could notice. But with time, they grew warmer, lasting longer, carrying a light that had long been buried. She found herself laughing softly at the playful chase of calves in the pasture, or at the way the rancher muttered to himself while fixing a stubborn fence. Even the evenings on the porch, once heavy with silence, began to feel lighter as she breathed in the prairie air, letting the weight of her past slip a little further away. For the first time in years, her heart no longer raced with fear when night fell. It rested. Peace, fragile but real, began to take root in her soul, and with it came a smile that told the world she was not just surviving anymore, she was living. What began as silence and distance slowly blossomed into something deeper, steadier than either of them had expected. Their bond was not born of sudden passion, but of countless quiet moments stitched together. The long rides across the prairie, the shared work in fields, the gentle way their eyes met and lingered a little longer each day. She began to trust his presence, leaning into the safety he offered without words, while he cherished the rare sound of her laughter as though it were the sweetest music. Love came not like a storm, but like the slow turning of seasons, soft and inevitable. By the time she realized it, she no longer felt like a guest on his land. She felt like the missing half of his life. And in his heart, the emptiness that had haunted him for years was finally filled by her quiet, unwavering presence. One golden afternoon, she stood on the porch, her hands resting lightly on the railing, and let her gaze wander across the land. The ranch stretched wide before her, no longer a lonely place, but a living home. Her daughters ran barefoot through the tall grass, their laughter ringing louder than the wind, chasing each other beneath the endless sky. Calves kicked up dust in the pasture, and the fields shimmered with life, ripe with promise. Where once she had seen only silence and emptiness, now she saw color, sound, and joy, proof that the land, like her own heart, had been waiting for this moment to bloom. In that stillness, she realized she was no longer a woman cast aside. She was a mother, a partner, and a keeper of a home finally alive with love. From across the yard, the rancher paused in his work, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His eyes found her standing on the porch, sunlight wrapping around her like a gentle halo, her hair stirring in the breeze as the children's laughter filled the air. For a moment he didn't move. He simply looked, taking in the sight that once seemed like an impossible dream. A warmth spread across his rugged face, not the kind of smile that sought to be noticed, but the quiet kind that came from deep within, born of gratitude and love. It was the smile of a man who had lived long in silence and found his heart answered at last, not with grand words, but with the simple, steady presence of the woman who now made his house a home. As the evening sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, she felt a stillness settle in her heart. Watching her daughters play and the rancher's quiet smile from across the yard, a realization washed over her like a gentle tide. She touched her chest softly, as if holding the truth close, and whispered to herself, her voice trembling but sure, "I was unwanted once, but now I am home." The words carried no bitterness, only peace, the kind that comes when pain finally gives way to belonging. For the first time, her past no longer defined her. The scars remained, but they no longer spoke louder than the love surrounding her. What was once emptiness had become fullness. What was once rejection had become a life chosen. And in that whisper, she claimed the ranch, the laughter, and the man who stood by her side, not as a gift she didn't deserve, but as a home she had finally found. As night settled over the prairie and the first stars appeared, she stood in the doorway of the house, the warm glow of lamplight spilling behind her. The rancher joined her in silence, their shoulders brushing as they looked out at the darkened fields together. In that moment, she thought of the long road that had led her here. The cruelty, the rejection, the nights she believed she would never be wanted again. Yet here she was, not only wanted, but cherished, her life woven into the land and the hearts around her. She breathed in deeply, her voice soft as a prayer. Sometimes love finds us where the world left us behind. The words lingered in the air, carried by the wind, wrapping around them both. And as the stars burned brighter above, the pain of the past finally gave way to the quiet, unshakable truth of a love that had found them when all hope seemed lost.